Hello and welcome back to AP World History Modern. Today we begin our fifth day on Unit 5.2, Revolutions, and with a focus today on nationalism. So our learning objective is explain the causes and effects of various revolutions in the period from 1750 to 1900. So we're looking at the effects of specifically the French Revolution, and I guess even more specifically, the Napoleonic era. All right, so that being said, how do we draw a straight line from Napoleon to nationalistic movements in the Philippines with Jose Rizal, Germany, right, New Zealand, Puerto Rico, and the Ottoman Empire? And of course, some of these lines are pretty straight and easy to draw. Some of them are a little bit more challenging, right? But I guess overall, the topic of nationalism, I guess, is kind of a good starting point. So, right, when we talk about nationalism, it means all kinds of things. In the case of countries like Germany, we're talking about, nationalism as a cohesive force, right? So bringing together, what was once a fragmented region into a shared border. And the same is true for Italy, all right? And of course, nationalism doesn't always have to be unifying as it is in Italy or in Germany. It can also be a divisive force as well. Or it can unify a group of people against someone else ruling over them. So when we think about people like Jose Rizal, in his propaganda movement in the Philippines, this is an example of unifying around a common thing in order to resist another. All right, Maoris, right, kind of similar, right, and of course Lola Rodriguez de Tio in Puerto Rico, and so we'll kind of connect some dots here. So I guess the first thing to do is, what is nationalism? And what does that word actually mean? And so I went kind of outside and I went and found a definition. So this is a definition from Penn State University. All right, so this is from their College of Earth and Mineral Sciences, and we got a nice basic definition here. All right, so what is a state? A state is an independent sovereign government exercising control over a certain spatially defined and bounded area whose borders are usually clearly defined and internationally recognized by other states. So states are tied to territory, states have bureaucracies, and states monopolize certain functions within its territory. So with that being the case, right, states, right, the United States undoubtedly could be categorized as a state. Right, and as could most other countries that you think of as countries, right? So a state. So what is a nation, right? And how do we distinguish between a state and a nation? So a nation is a little different here. So a nation is a group of people who see themselves as a cohesive and coherent unit based on shared cultural and historical criteria. Nations are socially constructed units, not given by nature. Their existence, definition, and members can change dramatically based on circumstances. Nations, in some ways, can be thought of as imagined communities that are bound together by the notion of unity that can pivot around religion, ethnic identity, language, cultural practices, and so forth. So it doesn't have to include those, but it could include those. All right. So nation is a slightly different thing, and we don't really start using the concept of nation until the French Revolution. Hence, we say that the French Revolution gives rise to nationalism. All right, and so in class, I generally kind of take a quick break here, and we watched this video. So this was a video that is created by the New York Times. It's called "National Identity is Made Up." I'll put a link for it on my webpage for you. Right, but I also stop this just we kind of watch bits and I stop and I break it down for notes for you as we go through. So I'm just gonna give you the notes that I provide during this little a few clips that we watch. So just so that you have what we did in class, right? So we start off, right, and I really am just following the video here, right? We follow by breaking down what is nationalism, right? So nationalism, right? And nationalism is an attempt to create national identity. Right, to create national identity, and right, and that can be done, and it is done in the kind of post-Napoleonic era, down a few lines, right, down race or ethnic lines, language, right, down the lines of language, and then of course shared borders. Right, and I'm just going to throw one in here as well. Religion, right? Because I mean, you really don't need nationalism as a concept in Western Europe before the 1500s, because there was a common religion, and of course, religion becomes fragmented following the Protestant Reformation, right? Following Martin Luther, and so common religion could be also used as used for national identity purposes, right? And of course, we've looked at things like Louis XIV's policies on religion, the Edict of Fontainebleau, for example. All right, so these are kind of the origins, right? The origins, and then the question becomes, right? So then we watch a little bit more of that clip, and of course it is kind of one interesting fact that they go over in that piece is when they talk about France, France and France's language in 1789, right before the revolution, they give you these two statistics here that one half of the people who lived within the territorial borders of France could not speak French. Right, could not speak French. And then they kind of give this other fact that only 1 in 8 people in France, right, living within the borders of France, were fluent, could actually speak it well. This is kind of hard to wrap our mind around, given modern ideas of what a nation is. But you got to kind of realize that kind of evolution of decentralization moving towards centralization, and how that's not going to impact everyone, kind of as that transition takes place, right? So of course, so we watch a little bit more of that film, and then we kind of stop again, and then we talk about these ideas that they go across, right? So they then kind of run through these reasons, right? Reasons for an increase in nationalism. Right? Reasons for an increase in nationalism. So why do we see this increase in nationalism in the late 1700s through early 1800s, right? Why is it that we see this increase? And they list off a couple of reasons, right? So one is urbanization. Right? Urbanization. So, urbanization can be a very scary thing for a state. Imagine being in Parliament in the late 1700s, having kind of watched Liverpool undergo the kind of growth that it went through, and was going through at that time. Right? Urbanization presents unique challenges that had not existed before for states to maintain control. And so urbanization is going to be one of the factors which will push states to embrace this idea of national identity. Another is mass communication. All right. Increases in literacy, increases in interconnectedness, is also gonna result in a need for states to embrace this idea of national identity. Another one is let's just say, the rise of total war. Right, the rise of total war, and right, this one in particular is it's a little kind of hard to understand because it's not really explained in the piece. So let me just kind of tell you real quick about this. So really, in Europe, starting with Louis XIV, you are seeing European powers emulating what the Ottomans were doing. So the Ottomans, they will have a professional army, the Janissaries, right? So with a professional army corps, you're going to see other countries who want to be able to have military parity with the Ottomans. You're going to see an emulation of a professional military class, and we really see that growing under Louis XIV in the 1600s. So by the time we get to the French Revolution, you're going to see a growing professional military under the second stage, under the Jacobin phase of the revolution. You're going to see a very large growing army, to the point where by the peak of the Napoleonic Wars, you see like Napoleon's army, in 1612, right, is 600,000 plus, right? That's 1812, his invasion of Russia, right? So 300,000 plus French, plus 300,000 other Europeans. And when you start talking about total war, you have to factor in, and you need to think about the amount of resources required. All right, and demands support of entire population. I mean, France is a pretty big country at the time in Napoleon. 20, probably in the neighborhood of 25 to 28 million people, lived in France at that time. So 300,000 soldiers is, that's a pretty big military corps for a population of that size, which means you not only need, families to have their children go off to fight, but also you have to clothe 300,000 troops, or 600,000 plus in the larger army. You need to clothe them. You need to get them a gun. You need to supply them with ammunition. You need to feed them, as they march thousands of miles into Russia. It's the amount of resources that are shifted to this effort is massive. And in order to make this work, you need the population to support you. You need the population to identify with what you are trying to do with your project, right? So that's what total war is referring to there, right? And then the last thing, and this is stated by the documentary here, or that little film clip that we watched, right? The decline of the church. Right, and we do see a revival of the Roman Catholic Church within France, under Napoleon, the Concordant, right? But the damage that was done by Maximilien Robespierre and the Committee on Public Safety to the church will never fully recover the church's position within its society. And of course, the church was a unifying force within French society. So as that role declines, something has to fill that void. And I think that is the assertion being made by that. All right. All right. So then we go ahead and we kind of finish that piece. And then it mentions towards the end of the piece this idea of post World War II, and of course the values of national identity, in the pre World War II United States, or world for that matter, Because this kind of stuff is definitely not going to work for France or England in the years after decolonization takes place. Right. So in the post World War II, post decolonization world, national identity based on these factors are not going to work. So what we see happen is they don't give up on this notion of nationalism, but it changes. All right. And what we see is this idea of nationalism. Slide this. So I thought I fixed that, and I did not. All right. So we see, and it's still not over far enough. All right. Nationalism. All right. And I'm talking post. All right. Post. There we go. Post World War II. All right. So let me just kind of subdivide my little space here. All right. Post World War II. Right. Nationalism is based on shared values. All right. So when race and ethnicity, language, borders, religion aren't going to work as unifying factors, then shared values will become what is used. And if this is our nation, right? How can we promote nationalism as a cohesive force, right? Nationalism as a cohesive force. And they identify a couple things in the film, and I'm just going to add a couple of others and just clarify. So one of the things he says, and let me still not over quite fine. There we go. All right, one of the things he identifies there is hard work. There you go. Hard work. So what does that mean? That means things like entrepreneurship. Maybe a little better way to say it. All right. Okay, there's a P there. All right. Entrepreneurship. All right. So what does that mean? That means, I should be able to, apply and try to get and work in any job I want to get in. I should be able to start a business. All right. I should be able to, to buy and sell whatever I want to sell. Right. Within reason. Right. So this is one of these factors. All right, so hard work. All right, hard work. Another one they identified. I guess there's only two that they identify. So the second one is freedom. All right, so freedom is another value or shared value that say people in the United States have in common, regardless of language or race or religion. You do have this shared value of freedom, right? We believe in the protection of civil liberties. Right. So, things like freedom of speech. All right, freedom of speech, freedom of religion. It doesn't matter what religion you are, right? Under this shared value, because I believe that you should be able to practice whatever religion you want to practice. Another one, it wasn't really said there, but let's just kind of give you another one. Democracy, right? That'd be safe to say is a shared value that exists within the United States. A belief in self-determination. Right, a belief in self-determination. What would be another one? Equality. Right, equality of opportunity. Might be another one, right? So everyone should have the ability, right? The same ability to do things as everyone else in the country, right? So these are examples of nationalism as a cohesive force. things that would bind a country together. Right. So, and in the post World War II world, we see nationalism, sometimes being applied in real life like that, right? But sometimes that does not work, right? Sometimes nationalism as a cohesive force does not work. So sometimes we see nationalism, right? Nationalism as a divisive force, right? Nationalism as a divisive force, right? So sometimes we have examples of those kind of classic things and classic factors that used to make up nationalism. Sometimes the bridge is just too big to gap. So religion can sometimes be a divisive force for a society. Right, so religion can be a divisive force. Language, right? Language can be a divisive force. Race / ethnicity can be a divisive force. Ideology, right? Ideology can be a divisive force. Sometimes socio-economics / let's just put class. All right. So let me just kind of break up my circle. Okay. Because the symbolism of what I'm saying is so important. Okay. All right. There's a little bit of a fragmented circle there. All right. And there you go. All right. So sometimes, right? Sometimes these, right, when values are not shared, right? When values are not shared, you see those traditional things that make up nationalism can be divisive and result in the fragmentation. Of course, the most well known or the best examples that people usually think of about when you try to find examples of this are the Balkans. I think is the best one. All right, the Balkans, and of course, there's even a word called balkanization. Yeah, okay. Aniziation. That all fit on there? That's okay. So balkanization. All right. So we even have a word that means, when these values aren't shared and it results in, results in this. All right. And of course, if you look at the Balkans, let me just kind of put a little note here. I'm talking about Southeast Europe. All right. I mean, if you look at the history of the Balkans, kind of going back to, let's just say, the Romans, right? So, the Greeks, I guess, after Alexander the Great had unified that area, from Macedonia. It had been under Greek and then Roman control and then, Byzantine control, and then around the 1200s, you're going to start to see encroachment into Southeast Europe by the Turks. So eventually what becomes known as the Ottoman Empire will take control of this region. And the Ottoman Empire will introduce a new race. So you have Turkic, right? Turkic versus Slavic. All right. So that becomes one of the divisive factors. You have Islam versus Christianity, right? And of course, multiple forms of Christianity. So Orthodox Christianity, in addition to Roman Catholicism, right? So a couple of different forms of Christianity, Orthodox and Roman Catholic, right? With Sunni Islam in that region largely. So you're going to see racial or ethnic differences. You're going to see religious differences. And of course, you're going to see linguistic differences as well. All right. So, you have in a number of examples, of how this manifests itself. So in the late 1800s, and we'll talk about this later. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. I'm not going to put this down as notes, but in the late 1800s, you're going to see several parts of the Balkans separate themselves as autonomous from the Ottoman Empire, some of which will then come under the rule of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire or the Habsburgs. So, right, we're going to see this process play out between the 1880s and 1914. And following, and of course, if you're familiar with the causes of World War I, when you're a kid and you learn about World War I, you learn about nationalism as one of the causes. Why do you learn about nationalism as one of the causes? Because you have a Slavic nationalist, right? You have a Slavic nationalist, a Serb, right? A Serbian nationalist who assassinates the Habsburg heir apparent to the throne, Franz Ferdinand. And this is an act of nationalism. So this is kind of why you learn about nationalism, because you see the true manifestation of its power. To have to have effects on world events, especially by World War I. It's one of the main causes. It's a spark event of World War I. So we see that, and of course we also see this play itself out in during World War II. Was the Jasenovac concentration camps there, where you see a purge of Muslims, right, taking place during World War II. And of course, the most famous case is the creation of Yugoslavia. And of course, Yugoslavia will unwind itself in the late 1990s, and this fragmentation or this balkanization will result in the formation of a number of separate states. And of course, very famously, we see ethnic cleansing take place as a result of this. So, an example of genocide in the early 1990s by Slobodan Milosevic. Right. So nationalism can be destructive as well. All right. Okay. So we watched that little video clip, and that's kind of what we get out of that. And those are the notes that I provide, for that little video clip. All right. So a lot of notes. All right. And then at that point, right, we kind of come back, and now that we've kind of covered nationalism, let's kind of just run through kind of the basics, right? So where does nationalism spring from, and where can you first start to see nationalism? And of course, a lot of this has to do with the fact that France had to defend itself in the years following the revolution, and it's almost at a constant state of warfare from about 3 years after the revolution begins until the Battle of Waterloo. And this is kind of a good little reflection on what we see taking place here. After the French Revolution, there was a very new and important notion that everyone was a citizen rather than a subject. As a subject of your king, you might owe the monarch a debt of duty, but you didn't feel any kind of responsibility for the state. But as a citizen, the state belonged to you. So you were obliged to support and defend it. And that's one example of how culture has made a huge difference in how people fight and whether they want to. And when you see primary source accounts from military leaders who took on the French, they will almost always talk about the bravery of the French soldier relative to their own. Because you have this situation where they are defending something that is theirs, that they have ownership over, as opposed to they're earning a paycheck, right? They're a mercenary, or they're fulfilling a duty, right? So there's a big difference in how that soldier fights and how that soldier gets perceived, right, as a result. All right, so I'm just going to run down through, and this is kind of what I do in class, is I just do a really quick rundown of what the effects of the French Revolution were, right? It's just kind of one of those, we don't really need to know that much about all the ins and outs of the French Revolution. but it really does have massive effects. So I don't want to completely shortchange it and and just talk about the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizens. Right. So the effects of the French, that does not look very neat, Revolution. Not that I write neat anyway, but right, let me switch it. All right, so what are the effects of the French Revolution? So there's a couple of things you can kind of look at here. One is the Haitian Revolution. And we're going to spend a couple days on this, so I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but just kind of a real quick preview. The first phase of the Haitian Revolution is linked to the French Revolution, right? They're intertwined with each other, right? So the events of the French Revolution are going to be relayed back to Haiti, and you're going to see a direct connection between the two. All right. The second phase, right, as it kind of bleeds into the third, right. So these, right, the second phase comes to an end, and the third phase begins as part of something that happens under Maximilian Robespierre, the abolition of slavery. Right? And of course, that second phase ends because of the military success of the guy who eventually becomes the governor, Toussaint Louverture. Right, Toussaint Louverture. And of course, the French Revolution is also going to usher in, right? The Napoleonic phase is going to definitely, usher in the fourth stage or phase of the Haitian Revolution and give rise to Dessalines. Right, so Napoleon will have ordered the arresting of Toussaint Louverture, where he will be brought back to France in a prison and die, and then Dessalines will eventually win. Right. So 1804 is when the revolution ends. Right? So there's a direct effect of the French Revolution on multiple of phases of the French Revolution. Right? And of course, a lot of this is just Napoleon. Right? So obviously the early part is not Napoleon. Right? But a lot of this other stuff is. Right? So let's just kind of run through a little checklist of how Napoleon impacts, what effects the French Revolution has because of specifically Napoleon. One is Egypt. Right? One, of course, is Egypt. So Napoleon and his army he'll be ordered by the Directory to go and invade Egypt in 1798 through 1799, and there's a lot written about Napoleon, and they touch upon things like, he happened to be away numerous times when his name came up for purging. And by the time the Egyptian campaign, maybe the Directory is just trying to get rid of him because they're afraid of his status, that he might actually overthrow them. So, but we see him taking over Egypt, and of course, this is going to have implications, right? So, him and his army show up in Egypt. The British will destroy their fleet and strand the army there, right? And once Napoleon conquers Egypt, they'll then work their way up to Syria, where Napoleon will abandon his army. And of course, that will not be the last time that Napoleon abandons his army. He also does so in the winter of 1813, after the Russian campaign. Right, so, but of course, it's an interesting time. We see the Mamluks are defeated, who had been reasserting their control over Egypt from the Ottomans. The Mamluks have now been defeated, and with the vacuum created by the removal of Napoleon's forces, you're going to see the Ottomans reassert control there by sending an Albanian leader named Muhammad Ali. Right. So, and we'll talk about that later. Right. So that is one kind of quick impact. Right. And of course, 1899, right, when I don't want to put 1804, 1799, excuse me, right? When Napoleon abandons his troops in Syria, he goes back to France and then overthrows the Directory. And of course, he does so originally as a triumvirate, like an oligarchy, but he eventually eliminates all. But we don't need to get into all the specifics of that, right? But this is where he becomes a leader. All right. So then everything after this point will be him making decisions. So 1803, right? 1803. One effect of Napoleon in this is Napoleon will sells Louisiana. I'm sure I spelled that wrong. Louisiana Territory. All right, and so it's kind of an interesting thing because obviously France loses the Louisiana Territory as a result of the 7 Years' War. That territory had gone to Spain mostly, and Napoleon will negotiate for that land back shortly after he becomes the leader of France, and he only really has it for a couple of years, and of course he has a bigger plan. So the bigger plan is he is going to send his forces into Saint Domingue. He's going to reinstate slavery on the island of what is now Haiti. And then once the slavery had been reinstated, he was going to then send his troops to Louisiana and work on creating his North American empire. So had those plans worked their way through, obviously this would have dramatically affected the United States. The United States would have been a country from the Mississippi to the Atlantic, and west of the Mississippi then would have been French speaking, right? And but that of course does not occur. So, and of course the reason it does not occur is because of the lowly mosquito, right? So when Napoleon sends his troops to Haiti, a large percentage, like 3/4 of his troops, die of yellow fever, a mosquito-borne disease, which then kind of paralyzes his ability to reimpose slavery back on the island of Saint Domingue. Then forces him into a situation where he then needs to make a decision on what happens next. Realizing the dream is lost, he then decides to cash in on the Louisiana Territory and sells it to Jefferson. So Louisiana, so that's obviously going to be another major impact, right? There is no such thing as manifest destiny, but the mosquito came through. All right, 1804, right? Napoleonic Code, right? And of course, this is, if there's any vestiges of the French Revolution that survived the French Revolution's all stages, this becomes kind of one. This idea that, laws apply to all French citizens. All right, so the Napoleonic Code. Now, it's a very different legal code than what is used in England or the United States, right? It's not a law code. It's not a common law code, one based on precedent, right? So it's a different type of law code, but it is, one that will be emulated around the world. Right? A lot of countries will also adopt this. We also see in 1804, Napoleon crowns himself. Napoleon crowns himself emperor. All right, emperor. So titles of nobility are back, right? And of course, Haitian independence takes place in 1804. All right, other things. It really 1804 begins the major battles, the major wars, and of course 1808 through 1814. All right, 14. Is the Peninsular Wars, Peninsular Peninsular Wars, and so this is Spain and Portugal. Right, Spain and Portugal are invaded, and of course, this is going to have a direct impact on the Latin American revolutions. Put yourself in the position of somebody in New Spain. You're a peninsularis or you're a criollos within the Spanish Empire, and your king has now just been removed, and Napoleon has just put one of his family members on the Spanish throne. How strong are your loyalties to the Spanish crown at that point? So we're going to see numerous revolutions break out within the colonies, the Spanish colonies in Latin America, as a result of the Peninsular Wars. All right, so that's so another major impact. 1812, right? 1812 is kind of a hard thing for Napoleon, right? And I do have a little visual for this, but you have this thing called the continental system. All right, the continental system. And let me just run this PowerPoint really quick. All right, so we have Napoleon. He crowns himself emperor, right? Crowns himself emperor. Symbolically takes the crown from the Pope and puts the crown on his own head, ending the 1,000-year tradition that had been established under Charlemagne, right? And and then we see the wars will then break out. And Napoleon does a pretty effective job at taking over the continent, most of the continent. So obviously we have France. We have areas that were officially allied to France by him putting his family members onto the thrones. And then other parts that were just controlled by him. But there was one that was not, right? Obviously England was not. So you have this trading zone, right, which included countries that was allied to him or controlled by Napoleon. But you also had Russia, which was in that trading zone. And Napoleon tries to create an economic zone in which England is left out. And this is known as the continental system, right? And so there's an attempt made to exclude England. And Russia does not want to play along, right? So Russia is part of this economic zone, but will not exclude. And that is going to be enough to put Russia on the target list, right? So, very famously, the Grand Army is going to invade. And this is one of those vocab words that it's just good to know this word. So, when you talk about Napoleon, and the invasion of Russia, it's an interesting thing that Napoleon doesn't actually lose this war, but this war costs him almost everything, and will eventually cost him everything. So what happens is you have like the Russian army and the French army. As it approaches, the Russian army simply evades, right? It simply retreats. But in doing so, they don't just retreat, they literally burn everything. And this is one of those things you need to understand about this time period is, when you kind of look at a map, you have an army invading Russia, right? So Moscow is like way back here, and right, kind of where the cursor is. And you have this massive army, 600,000 plus people marching their way across Europe. And there is no modern railroad lines. Obviously the automobile is nowhere near invented by this point in history. So the question becomes, how do you supply an army of 600,000 people? The traditional way in which armies supplied themselves was they simply took from the land that they were on. So they would take food from the fields. They would kill the cattle that they saw. Raid the silos and barns that they came across. And what the Russians do is they will simply retreat and they will burn everything, so that there will be no food to eat, right? There will be the cattle will all be massacred, so that there is nothing, right? So when you see scorched earth, that's what that is referring to. And by the time Napoleon gets to Moscow, and he makes it all the way to Moscow, Moscow is in flames. All right, so the two armies never come into a direct battle, like a full-scale battle. There are small skirmishes, but nothing decisive. That eventually would lead to lead to a surrender, right? And so then Napoleon, once he gets to Moscow, he has to make a decision. Do I stay and wait for them to come back so we can have this grand battle, and have them surrender to me? Or do I go back home? Do I retreat back to France and then have to do this whole thing over again the next year? So he makes the decision to stay for over a month. They sit and they wait, and then the decision to return home is made. And so he will return to Paris, and like in Syria in 1799, he will simply leave the army and he will make his way back because of talk of revolt back in Paris. So he goes back and stabilizes things back in Paris. But his troops did not fare so well. So, the 300,000 French troops that he left with, he ends up, with about 35,000 making it home alive. A really devastating loss. And here's an infographic kind of showing you the Russian campaign. So the width is the number of troops in the Grand Army, and you can see kind of desertion as they made their way to Moscow became the norm, and then climate or weather became the issue. So you can kind of see on this. So this is showing you the brown is the march to, and the black is the march back. And then down here you're seeing the weather temperatures as they made their way back. So this kind of matches up with the average temperature when they were at these spots. And of course, these are on the Lumiere scale, which we don't use the Lumiere scale. So I found a conversion scale on the internet. And so when you see like down here, 30 degrees on the Lumiere is about negative 35 on Fahrenheit. Right. So the soldiers died from starvation, exposure, right, to the cold, and of course this is going to result in the exile, right? So let me just finish up a couple things here. All right. So following Russia, following the debacle in Russia, he will get back and he will rebuild his army. There's always a new graduating group of kids coming out of school. But you're going to see, the British especially taking advantage of this weakness, and you're going to see a massive naval defeat at the Battle of Leipzig. All right. I don't know if I spelled that right or not, but the Battle of Leipzig, and then the British are then going to then invade France. So in 1814. Napoleon, and we're really not getting into effects here, I'm just kind of talking. Napoleon will abdicate. All right, he'll abdicate and then exile. Exile to Elba. Right, a little teeny island off the coast. He then comes back. Right, he comes back for what's known as the 100 Days in the Battle of Waterloo. All right, the Battle of Waterloo, and this is in 1815. All right, and and of course Waterloo is in Belgium today. All right, and about a 2-hour drive outside of Paris, and of course Napoleon will then will also lose that one, and then he'll be exiled to Saint Helena. All right. Here's let me kind of see if we have some kind of images here. All right, so Elba, right? See where Elba is on the map. So remember, Napoleon himself is Corsican, right? He's Corsican, but so Elba is right there. He comes back from there for the 100 days, and then loses at the Battle of Waterloo, and then goes to Helena. It's a little teeny island out in, you can't even see it, can you? Let me kind of exit full screen so you can. All right, so a little teeny island off from the coast of Africa. All right, so one of the more remote places on the planet. I don't even think you can get there by plane today. All right, so St. Helena. All right, and of course, this is the big effect of Napoleon, right? The kind of lasting effect of Napoleon is the Congress of Vienna. So let's kind of kind of summarize this over here really quick. So the Congress of Vienna. So 1815. It was actually a meeting when Napoleon came back. And they probably realized they needed to stop watching the opera in the theater or the orchestra and get down to business, right? So the Congress of Vienna, right? So it's got a couple goals, right? Couple goals. One is redraw borders, right? Redraw the borders that had been disrupted and maintain a balance of power in Europe. Now, we're not in a European history class, so we don't really need to worry about who these major players were, but obviously it's going to be the major powers. So there's going to be representatives from Austria and England, and et cetera, right? France will have its own representative there. So a balance of power is the ultimate goal here. And this is why sometimes you see this referred to as the concert of Europe, right? Essentially, if Europe is an orchestra, then if you want to have harmony, then you need to have the right ratio of balance within the orchestra, right? So if you have too many drums, then the percussion will disrupt the harmony of the orchestra, and you won't be able to, to hear the flutes, right? And so you want to maintain that balance. You want the concert to be in harmony. So this is why you kind of you'll sometimes see concert of Europe used to describe the concert of Vienna. And you'll also see sometimes Humpty Dumpty used as a reference, right? So Humpty Dumpty, had a great fall. That's the French Revolution. And the Congress of Vienna is all the king's horses and all the king's men trying to put the old order, right, back together again. So they will put the Bourbons back on the throne in France. And of course, there's going to be another revolution in 1830. See the Delacroix painting, see Les Miserables, right? And so there's an attempt to rebalance and restructure Europe, but obviously there's going to be some major issues. Sometimes it'll succeed, sometimes it'll fail. 1848 is a kind of really good example of the success of the concert of Europe. I mean, you've got major revolutions that break out all over Europe, and they're all successfully squashed with the aid of each other. So and sometimes the concert does work, but of course, when you start talking about what happens with Germany, this is the addition of a different part of the orchestra, which will throw the concert out of harmony, right? So we see the rise of Otto von Bismarck during this era in realpolitik. All right, and of course he in 3 stages creates crisis to unify Central Europe into Germany. So this is kind of one of those. There's a very well-known comedy routine about what keeps you up at night, right? What keeps you up at night? Germany keeps you up at night. All right. And I guess that's probably the best place to stop here, right? So we kind of talked about nationalism spreading, but all right. I'm definitely out of time. All right. So some key takeaways: concert of Europe, resulting from the Congress of Vienna, will attempt to keep forces of nationalism at bay, but ultimately, not be able to. And I guess I did not do a good job at drawing lines to anyone except for Germany. But time is what it is, right? All right. So I will have to talk about those things at a later date. If you are interested in the propaganda movement, on my webpage, I do have a link directly for this. This is the Freemanpedia video. It's a really neat, quick summary of Rizal, and so I would highly encourage you to watch this as an example of nationalism. Besides the one that I drew a straight line to with Germany for. All right, so highly encourage you to watch that. All right, that is all for today. Sapriati.